Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over a cool video, the Icelandic Gambit, and it derives from the Scandinavian Defense, which starts with pawn to e4. Again, a move from white that you're going to see very often, which is going to give you a lot of opportunities to actually play the Icelandic Gambit. And then pawn to d5. This is the Scandinavian Defense. After white takes, black has a lot of different options. You may have seen, queen takes here on d5. But this comes from knight coming to f6. White has a lot of different options, but the Icelandic Gambit is the pawn coming here to c4, and then the pawn now coming to e6. Now, there are other gambits. The pawn could come here to c6, but the Icelandic Gambit, again, is the pawn coming here to e6. From here, there's a lot of variations that we're going to be going over in the Icelandic Gambit. The first and most common that we're going to be spending a lot of time on is the main line, and that's the pawn coming to e6, and then the bishop recapturing here on e6. And again, if we kind of look at this, black has given up material for a rapid lead in development. He has two of his minor pieces developed in the center of the board. He's attacking this, pawn here on c4. He has this queen on the semi-open file D file. So, a lot of attacking lines. White currently has none of his minor pieces involved into the game, so he's going to have to find a way to really combat black's strong attacks. Now, the first thing you may see is the pawn come to d4. Again, he does have the light square bishop here on f1 defending this bishop, or this pawn here on c4, so doesn't have to worry about that right away. He could try to counterattack in the center of the board with like pawn to d4. From here, the bishop's just going to come to b4, put in the king in check. White has a lot of different options. One option that you may see is just knight coming to c3. Now, this is a pretty terrible move from white. Black can go ahead and bring his knight to e4, putting a lot of pressure. He's now attacking this knight, and this knight is pinned down. How can he really combat that? He can always bring his queen to c2. Unfortunately, the queen can now come to d4 since the queen was the only protector of that pawn. Black has not only taken back the material that he's lost early on, but he's now all up in white's base. And it's going to be very, very hard for white to figure out how to get this light square bishop out, how to get this knight out, castle, so he can get some sort of safety, because black's really starting to put a lot of pressure. He can always, again, bring this bishop here to c4. He can always easily castle now. It's going to be very, very hard for white to hold on here. Black's definitely in the advantage right here. White could always try to bring his knight to f3. Black can go ahead and start to exchange some pieces. He can take bishop here on c3, check. So after the pawn takes, the queen can go ahead and come to c3. After the queen takes, the knight comes on c3. As you can tell right here, not only is black now up in material, not too long ago he was down, but he also has much better pawn structure going into the endgame. He's got two pawn structures of three. White has less pawns, but he has more pawn structures, and he does have this one isolated here on c4, which is going to be an easy target for black to really go after later on to the game. So again, very, very good game for black. Now, you may not see the queen come to c2. Another move could always be the bishop coming here to d2. That's going to lose automatically to the queen coming to d4 because the queen's no longer protecting it. Instead of the bishop coming to d2, the knight could come to e2, but unfortunately this light square bishop's no longer protecting this pawn on c4. The bishop can now gobble up this pawn right here. Again, black doesn't have a whole lot of great options. Now, the knight doesn't have to come to c3 early on. You could always see something like bishop come to d2. Black can go ahead and exchange here on d2 after the queen takes. Then black can play a nice little move, queen to e7. This is a theme that you'll see a lot in the Icelandic Gambit, basically setting up a discovered attack. After this bishop moves, let's say it takes here on c4, there's a discovered attack on the white king. So this is going to be a very, very powerful move from black. Obviously, he can get his knight involved into the game to c6 if he wants to, but at any moment he can move this bishop. And again, it's going to be very, very hard for white to get both of these minor pieces involved into the game so he can castle. Castling on the queen side, not really an option anymore. It's not going to be safe for him. So this, again, is going to be very, very good for black. Now, instead of the bishop coming there to d2, you could see something. It'd be a lot worse, but the knight could come, let's say, to d2 from here. The queen's just going to right away come in and gobble up this pawn on d4. So really, if you see this first move from white just bringing his pawn down to d4, it's very common, but you can just go ahead, high five your monitor or your computer, wherever you're playing chess, play bishop to b4, and know that you're just going to run over your opponent. Next move you may see, and it's actually one of the better moves from white, even though it's really painful to play white in this position against the Icelandic Gambit, but you could see knight coming down to f3, and then immediately the queen's going to come here to e7. Again, kind of that tactic we talked about. White has a lot of different moves, but he's not careful. The bishop's now going to just come to c4, really attacking this light square diagonal. And again, it's a discovered attack against white, and black's already regained all the material. Now, again, we don't have to go in every situation because, again, you're going to do the same thing. The knight comes to c3, and then black's going to recapture. The one move I do want to talk about is if the queen comes here to e2, because, again, the bishop can no longer take here. It's not a discovered attack. The queen could just come down immediately and take the queen, exchange. So I do want to go over this. And from here, the knight's just going to come here to c6. And this is also very powerful because black's really getting all of his pieces, into the game. Now, if you castle on the king side, that's very, a safe defense for your king. If you castle on the queen side, that's a much more aggressive castle. So again, if black castles on the queen side, then you can see his rook's going to be here on the d file. This is a semi-open file, so this is going to be very, very good for black. From here, white has a lot of different options. If he tried, his knight coming to c3, black can go ahead and castle on the queen side. Again, this rook is now very, very active. Again, not quite as safe for the king, but again, in the Icelandic Gambit, you're trying to be very, very aggressive. So this is going to be very good. Also, you can, instead of the knight coming to c3, you could always see, pawn to d3. Again, kind of a weak move. Black's going to do the same thing, castle on the queen side. The only move that you may change it up a little bit is if the pawn comes to d4. You're not really going to castle on the queen side anymore because the pawn could just push down to d5, attacking both your minor pieces. This is obviously going to be bad. Instead, if the pawn comes down to d4, all you're really going to do is play bishop here to f5. Now, white has two different options. He could continue to come down and just play, pawn to d5. This is probably one of the worst moves he can make. From here, the knight can just come to b4, getting ready to attack here on c2, as long as that queen's not there. So this is going to be very good from black. He can always still castle on the queen side now. Very, very strong attack along this d file. Instead of the pawn coming down to d5, the queen can go ahead and come here to e7, and then black can go ahead and take here on e7. Now, if you look at this, black is down in material. He's down one pawn, but all of his minor pieces are developed. He can castle on the king side. He can castle on the queen side. It's going to be very, very hard for white to hold on to the small advantage that he does have, because black's just overwhelming him as far as the development standpoint. So this is going to be a very, very good game for black. Black's actually ahead in this position, so you actually don't mind seeing the queen come down here to e2 earlier on in this situation. It's going to be okay. So that's, again, what's going to happen if the knight comes here to f3. Next move you might see from white is bringing the knight here to c3, kind of along those, English opening lines. It's going to be the same pretty much from black. He's going to bring his bishop here to b4. White has a lot of different responses. We've already seen what happens if his pawn comes here to d4. The knight's going to go ahead and swoop in here to e4. Again, we've already kind of played this out. This is going to be very, very good for black. Now, instead of the pawn coming here to d4, he could always try to get his other knight involved into the game. Again, he needs to find a way to get safety for his king, so he could try to get his light square bishop involved into the game. From here, black's going to go ahead and play this, queen to e7. We've already talked about this really great ability for the bishop to come here to c4. So this is going to be, again, very, very good. Now, instead of the knight coming here to f3, you could always see a move like pawn to a3, trying to kick the bishop away. The bishop can go ahead and take. It's not a problem. If he, recaptures with his pawn on, his b pawn, then again the queen can come back here to e7. Again, putting a lot of pressure. This discovered attack right here. Again, if the queen comes here to e2, that's fine. Black can go ahead and castle on the king side. Then he can swing his rook over to e8. Again, putting a lot of pressure on this e file. This is going to be very good for black. Black doesn't mind at all. If if instead white decides, let's recapture with a c-pawn, black can go ahead, exchange off queens, and after that, the knight can come here to c6. Next move, if he wants to, he can come over here to a5. It's going to be very hard for white to hold on to his material advantage. Obviously, the next move he could take here. If the pawn comes up, he could take here on b3. Again, he has a lot of different options. Again, his knight can come involved into the game. He can start to attack. If this is weakened, he can always come here to f2. And black still has options. He can castle on the queen side. Putting his rook attacking on the d file. Black is going to have a very, very good game in this situation. So, again, if white plays, knight to c3 early on, that is completely okay. Now, sometimes your opponent may not take here on e6, and that's fine. Black's still going to have a really good game, but I do want to go over some of the situations that you may see arise from this situation right here. So, first one that you may see is knight to c3. Again, simple development move, but trying to put a lot of pressure on this pawn to d5. White's just going to go ahead and take. After the pawn takes, black can go ahead and take. White can recapture if he wants to. Black's going to be ahead as far as development. He does have an extra piece developed in the center of the board, and white now has this. He has 3 pawn chains. He does have this in the middle that doesn't. It's kind of isolated right there. So this is going to be okay for black. Black doesn't mind that. If we kind of reverse the order, instead he takes with his knight, it's going to be exactly the same thing. Black's going to kind of come out ahead. So again, don't mind this at all. Now, if you see instead of knight to c3, if you see knight to f3, it's going to be very similar. If they don't want to take with their pawn on d5, then black is going to take the pawn on d5. So same kind of thing. He can capture, or the next move, black can capture. He can start to develop his other minor pieces. It's going to be somewhat similar. Now, sometimes you may not see either of the knights. You could see a move like pawn to d4, basically saying, okay, you can take this back. I still want to control the center of the board. Again, anytime you see this pawn coming up, you're immediately high-fiving somebody and bringing your bishop to b4 because you know it's going to be a good game. So from here, there's a lot of different things. You could always see bishop coming to d2, and that's fine. We can go ahead and exchange bishops. Let's say the knight retakes, then black's just going to go ahead and retake here on d5. This is going to be a completely fine game for black. If instead of the bishop coming there, we have the knight coming to c3, this is probably better for black. Again, black's just going to recapture on d5. And now this knight is pinned down. He can't really do anything. He can't capture this bishop here on b4, so he's kind of at a loss. Let's say he does capture with his pawn here on d5. Black can recapture with his knight. He's now attacking this knight again. Also, it's being pinned down. He can get his other pieces involved into the game. Again, this is going to be very good. Black can easily castle as soon as he wants. He has kingside safety. This white king is still trying to figure out how in the heck am I going to be safe, because this every scenario we're looking at, the king's kind of in the middle of the board and he's kind of attacked all the time. So again, it's going to be good for black. Now, another thing you may see, instead of the pawn coming up to d4, a lot of people like to put their opponents in check, so you could see queen come down to a4. Very simple. Black's going to play bishop to d7. White has a lot of different options. He really needs to be playing queen to b3. If he doesn't, if he just comes back to c2 or d1, those are kind of wasted moves. All black's going to do is just start gobbling up material. He's already equalized right here. And so it's kind of a wasted move. He really doesn't have any of his minor pieces. He's not controlling the center of the board at all anymore. So going to be a very good game from black. Again, the one thing that you may see is the queen coming back here to b3. Again, adding an extra defender here on these pawns. But again, pretty easy from here. Black's still going to just take here on d5. Now, white has different options. He can either take with his pawn. He can always come down here and take on b7. Let's say he does come down here and take on b7. Then the knight can come to c6, allowing the rook here to come to b8 and still protecting this pawn on a7. Again, it's going to be really hard for white to kind of hold on to his queen on b7 unless he gets it out of the way. Now, if he does decide, okay, I want to start getting out of the way because black can start to attack me, he did gain this pawn and material. Again, he took it. But from here, black can play, bishop to c5, he's really starting to get all of his minor pieces involved into the game. White, his king's still in the middle of the board. He's not going to be able to castle anytime soon. This white queen, although it did capture a pawn, in chess it's not all about being up in material. Sometimes it's having more material in the fight, and right now white does not have that. So if he tried something like knight to f3, trying to get something involved into the game, black can come here to g4, putting pressure on the pawn on f2. Black just has so many different attacks. Again, he can castle on the king side for safety anytime he wants to. White's not really doing a whole heck of a lot. So this is going to be very good for black. Instead of, moving his queen back right away, he could get kind of selfish and say, I'm just going to take this pawn here on d5. The knight can come here and take on d5. And then again, putting pressure on this queen. If the queen comes back here to, b3, black can kind of set a trap here. He can play, knight to d4. Nice little trap because, from here the queen's like, okay, what am I going to do? I'll go ahead and take, this knight here on d5. That's kind of a free piece. But unfortunately, again, we're all about these discovered attacks. The knight can now come to c1. And after the king moves, then the bishop now has a discovered attack. So he moves, attacking the king. Something's going to have to give, and this queen is going to fall very, very shortly. So again, there's just so many different ways for white to hang themselves in the Icelandic Gambit. Those were the main lines that you'll see in the Icelandic Gambit. If you guys are curious, I can make another video. Instead of sometimes coming down with the pawn to c4, you could always see something like the pawn coming down to d4 saying, you know what, I'm up in material, but I feel like something funny is going on, so I'm going to play d4. Black can say, you know what, I'm not going to retake. I'm going to play the Portuguese Gambit and let's say play bishop to g4. So black has a lot of different variations, but we'll save that for another video. If you guys are interested, feel free to let me know. But I really enjoy the Icelandic Gambit. Again, I feel like it gives black so many different options, and if you're playing an opponent that's not really familiar with it, I feel like you're just going to run over the board because there's so many different aggressive lines. And the entire time it's so easy to keep your king safe, either on the king side or the queen side. So feel free to let me know what you guys think of this opening. Feel free to try it out, see if you guys have success. Hopefully you enjoyed watching, learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.